Well, good morning, everyone. CODA New South Wales here. I'm Joan Hughes, the President of Council on the Ageing in New South Wales, and it's so wonderful to have many of you join us right around New South Wales for this very important topic. Just recently, COTA New South Wales conducted a survey, as well as we had 8 focus groups, and we asked the people what were some of the top issues that they wanted us to do something about. And guess what came up? Of all the many issues, climate change was the issue of most concern to those people who filled out our survey. Here at Council on the Ageing New South Wales, we felt that it's important to challenge those stereotypes that older people often don't care about this issue because it's actually not true. So we thought, what a better way to try and understand the issues and look at what action some of our supporters and older people could get involved in was to hold a webinar. And for those of you who've joined our webinars this year, welcome back. For those of you who are new to our webinars, we're very pleased to have you on board. And we're so thrilled to have a range of speakers to educate us and help our understanding of the issues to do with climate change and climate action. To start with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are gathering on this morning. I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to other First Nations people who are joining us this morning. And Joshua Gilbert is one of those people. So I acknowledge you, Joshua, as a First Nations person, and so glad that you've joined our conversation this morning. So, Council on the Ageing, what does it stand for? Well, we call it CODA for short, but it's Council on the Ageing, and there's one of us in every state and territory. And our job is as a peak organisation, so that means we do policy work and we advocate on behalf of people in New South Wales who are over 50 years. We work with politicians, policymakers, and service providers and the media to make sure that the issues for older people are acted on. So, of course, we're all about change. For those of you who don't know some of the services that we provide, just have a look on our website. But we've got services regarding helping older people fill out wills. We've got helping older people navigate the aged care system, and that's a huge issue in itself. We have an exercise program which is called Living Longer, Living Stronger. And we have community speakers who are volunteers who go out to communities and talk to people about issues to do with older people. So that's a bit of a blurb, a bit of an intro, but let's get into what we're here to do. So just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. Everyone except the presenters, you're all on mute, which means you can't unmute yourself. This is a webinar, it's not a meeting. There's a Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. You can ask your own questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel, and we ask you to make sure those questions are respectful. You can upvote someone else's question if they're asking something that you would like to know. We'll be answering many of those questions during the panel discussion. There's also a chat panel that you'll see where you can make a comment during the presentation. And again, we ask you for those comments to be respectful. This event is being recorded and it will be available after the event on the CODA New South Wales YouTube channel. So please, if you have found this really worthwhile, we'd love you to tell the world, tell all the older people in New South Wales that you know and other people so they can actually view what you're going to hear about this morning. So they're a very important way of getting the information out and allowing people to have their say. Well, climate change. Well, as we all know, the climate is changing, and without significant commitments by all nations across the planet, we are facing increases in temperatures that will result on significant impacts on the health and well-being of everyone. And of course, we're very concerned about the health and well-being of older people in particular. Australia has already seen an increase of 1.44 degrees Celsius since national records began in 1910. This is impacting our communities, including those that are most vulnerable in numerous ways, not least with the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, heat waves, flooding, droughts, severe bushfire seasons, and the prevalence of drought never seems to leave us. And I do acknowledge that for some of you that have joined us this morning, this might be a difficult time that you've been through if you've been through fires and drought and all the other things due to us not dealing very well at a political level to do with action on climate. We know that older people will be vulnerable, and we know especially older people with chronic health issues will be more vulnerable if things don't change. And in the work that we've just done, the survey that I just referred to previously, older people told us that they want real policy action on climate, especially concerning their children and their grandchildren and the world that they will leave behind. Today's speakers will present from a variety of perspectives, including the outcomes of the recent climate summit in Glasgow, which we've all been following, hopefully on the news, the impacts of extreme heat on humans, the importance of food security and sustainability of farming in Australia, the Indigenous connection to land, and that's why we've got Josh with us. And we have a recording from Rebecca Huntley on how to talk with friends and family and colleagues on the issue of climate change in a way which makes it less divisive. So our first speaker this morning is Clive Hamilton. Clive is a professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University and a member of the board of the Climate Change Authority. He is the author of 18 books, and he has been writing about this for past 20 years, I believe, Clive. So very much, we'd love you to join us now and present what you want to share with us. And Clive also has been following the climate summit in Glasgow. So over to you, Clive. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Joan, and to COTA for putting on this webinar, which is an excellent opportunity for us to update our thinking about what's been happening in the climate change area, particularly after Glasgow, which was really a crucial meeting for the world. And I want to talk about that soon. So I'm hoping I can get some luck with sharing some slides. Can you see that graphic there, Joan? Okay, let me see how I go here. Yeah. Okay, I've lost a... Sorry, I just need to move this around a bit into technology, eh? It worked beautifully in our, here we go, in our presentation, in our practice, of course, but now it's not working so beautifully. I'm assuming that's okay and you can hear me. Okay, so as people who've been reading the newspapers know, in the months before COP26, sorry, I'm just getting a message, technology. It drives us all nuts, doesn't it? I'm being told that the slideshow isn't coming up. Is that so?
Hold on. I saw it before, Clive. The slides were up, but now they seem to have disappeared, and there's an unusual slide here that I'm not sure what it means. But maybe if you just keep talking.
Okay.
See how we go.
And hope that things change.
Oh, there, I can see it. I can see it now.
Okay, good. All right. So, as everyone knows, there have been some really severe weather events, even in the last year or so. There have been wildfires in Siberia and in the United States, floods in Germany and India, extreme heat waves in Canada and Russia. And all of that was with just 1.1 degrees of global warming above the pre-industrial average. Australia, it's 1.4. And in August of this year, the 6th assessment report of the UN's panel of scientists, the IPCC, concluded that the world is expected to reach 1.5 degrees in the early 2030s. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres declared that the new report represented code red for humanity And he said it must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. Extremely strong words to come from a UN Secretary General. And of course, we in Australia have been watching and suffering through the fires and flood events and droughts a couple of years ago. The scale of the greenhouse gas reduction task for the world was set or updated in 2015 at the Paris conference, when all of the parties to the Framework Convention met and resolved that warming should be kept well below 2 degrees centigrade and preferably limiting the rise to no more than 1.5. And this was demanded by particularly small island states, including some in our neighbourhood, because they are literally being inundated. But the world has delayed acting for so long that the emissions task now looks much more difficult, as this slide, which I hope you can see, shows. These are emission reduction paths for the globe, a whole range of them, which show how quickly emissions must be reduced, depending on how long we delay before emissions globally reach a peak. And when we think about that for 2 degrees, for 1.5 degrees, it becomes even steeper, almost impossible, in fact, if we delay any longer, because that means very, very rapid, perhaps 7 to 10% per year of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which is really extraordinary. And yet, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is really big. So here in this chart, we can see at the top, the global population exposed to severe heat every 5 years goes from 14% to 37% as one kind of illustration of what is involved. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 is very big. And of course, they are much worse if the Earth warms by 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees, which is where we're headed now. So the Glasgow conference, COP26, that's Conference of the Parties number 26, really mattered for galvanizing global action. And this is a chart of really what needs to be done to get to a 1.5 or make it within reach compared to what countries around the world are doing now. And you can see there has to be an enormous ramp up in transition to renewables, in shift to electric vehicles, to electrifying industry, increasing tree cover 5 times faster than it's currently happening. So before Glasgow, many nations made pledges to increase their ambitions to cut their emissions. Over 150 did so, submitting stronger 2030 emission reduction targets. But Australia didn't, and only very reluctantly committed to net zero by 2050, which is kind of, I mean, if you don't do that, you simply don't care about climate change. You don't believe the science if you're not willing to commit to 2050. That's kind of, child's play compared to what we really need to do. So what was achieved at COP26? Well, a broad pact calling for renewed efforts to raise ambition to cut emissions came out of it. It called for greater commitments from countries, rich countries, to finance poorer countries to help them adapt and cut their emissions. There was an agreement to sharply cut methane emissions, the second most important greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide. There was a commitment to end forest loss. And there was a resolution, which we probably all read about, put to the conference to phase out coal quickly. And that was changed on the intervention of India and China from phase out to phase down coal. The bottom line of what came out of Glasgow is shown in this rather troublesome chart, which I hope you can see. It shows where we're headed with global emissions and what those emission paths mean for warming.
Clive, I was just wondering, can you bring the slides up a little bit? We can see, yeah, that's better, much better. I think that might, yeah, that's lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
good.
You. Yep.
So the blue band at the top shows where we're going, where we're headed now. on current policies and actions, 2.7 to 3.1 degrees by 2100, which would be catastrophic by any measure. The blue line is where nations are committed to after Glasgow. So we're heading for 2.4 degrees according to pledges and targets made at and just before Glasgow. The green dotted line is where we need to be, where global emissions need to travel to be consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming, only 1.5. So you can see the gap is enormous. And each year we leave it, we delay the peak in global emissions, the bigger that gap becomes and the more difficult it is to transition economies into doing it. And the fact is, and I'll finish on this point, that in many cases, the commitments made by countries are not yet matched by policies that exist or are being implemented. And that certainly goes for Australia, as we saw with the Australian government's roadmap, which was really extremely vague and didn't really have a plan to meet net zero by 2050, let alone some reasonable benchmarks along the way to 2050, in particular 2030. So the world is still a long, long way from the actions needed to limit warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. Leaving those actions to the 2030s will simply be too late, if it isn't too late already. And so the countries at Glasgow agreed to reconvene in a year's time with an expectation that countries, and particularly countries like Australia that failed to make stronger pledges, will make higher commitments then, so that we can have some confidence that the world can reach 2 degrees limit and hopefully the 1.5 degrees limit. Thank you.
Clive, you referred to the IPCC report.
Yes.
Do you think that's had much influence?
Oh, I think it's had an enormous influence. Oh, yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, more than, it's the sixth, as I said. The first one, I think, was in the early 1990s. And each time the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brings out a new report, the predictions or the projections become more alarming. They're matched by real world events, and more people around the world are taking notice, not least industry. And one of the interesting things at Glasgow was the arrival of the biggest institutional investors from these huge insurance companies and pension funds and so on, accounting for trillions of dollars worth of investment. And they were saying, we are not going to invest in climate damaging activities anymore. So that was a positive, a definite positive to come out of Glasgow.
Mm-hmm. Great. Oh, Clive, thank you. We'll come back to you after the other panelists have shared their knowledge with us with some other key questions, but thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'd like to introduce Emma Bacon. Where are you, Emma? Oh, there you are.
I'm here.
Good. Emma is a passionate organiser, a campaigner and an activist. Always like those three words. If you're doing all of that, Emma, you must be a top person. Emma's worked across the union, global justice and environmental movements for more than 10 years. She's founded a terrific organisation that we think is really going to make some change called Sweltering Cities, which is the aim is really to try and influence everyone, especially governments and community and people, so that we have got more livable, sustainable and equitable cities. Over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan, and thanks to everyone for having me today. It's a real honour to speak to everyone about this really important issue. I want to first acknowledge that I'm joining today from Gadigal land. I think that, you know, not only do we have to, you know, we need to acknowledge that this is a land of the First Nations people, the Aboriginal people of this area, and for me, yes, it's Gadigal land, but also acknowledge the leadership of those communities and those people in this area. You know, and that we need to look to the Aboriginal community and the First Nations people in Australia and around the world to show us how we can live better with the environment in a more sustainable way. And so I'll go ahead now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Sweltering Cities. I'm going to go a little bit over the results of our community survey from last year. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions that are going to both help us adapt to and mitigate climate change. So as Joan said, Sweltering Cities works directly with people affected by extreme heat and rising temperatures to advocate and campaign for more livable, sustainable and equitable cities. We know that there's urban heat islands in our cities that can be 10 to 15 degrees hotter than some of the cooler coastal suburbs. And I'm talking here about large sections of Western Sydney, Southwest Sydney and parts of Northwest Sydney. And I think that, you know, looking at people saying where they're joining from today, there's people who are here at this event who probably have personal experience of feeling how hot some of those communities can feel. But what does that feel like in an individual sense? I've been speaking to, you know, hundreds of people over the last couple of years about what that feels like. You know, I've been to a woman called Kim, and each summer she's really worried about how she's going to afford the electricity bills to cool her house using air conditioning. So she waits until she feels sick with heat, and then she'll go and sit in her car for a couple of hours to cool down. Or I've been speaking to Peter, and he's a passionate gardener. But he knows that in summer heat, he can't go out in the middle of the day. So he wakes up really early to do his gardening, but he's still devastated when after a heat wave, lots of his plants end up baking or frying in the sun. And that can really affect, you know, his local environment, how he feels about his home. Or I've been talking to a woman called Gemma, who lives just north of Penrith. She's got a little boy, just turned 4 a couple of days ago. And she is dreading summer because she knows that in her house, which is an affordable housing house with no air conditioning and no ceiling fans, she's really worried about her son. Little kids can't regulate their body temperature in the way that adults can. And so she knows that on some nights she's going to have to leave the house, go to, you know, her parents' house and other places because she doesn't feel safe in her home. And that's a scary thought, right? That there are people who are already feeling unsafe in their homes in summer in Sydney. Too often, we think of extreme heat as an individual problem we've got to cope with by ourselves. And I'm sure lots of people here have felt that sense that like I'm responsible for keeping myself cool. You know, if I can't pay for air conditioning costs, that's my problem. But actually each summer, thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people are experiencing the same thing. So if we can think of extreme heat as a collective problem instead of an individual problem, then we can come up with collective solutions that support us all. So Sweltering Cities is working at the intersection of health, inequality, and climate change. And we're aiming to, firstly, win community campaigns that create more sustainable, livable, and equitable cities. These are campaigns with solutions and strategies that can be repeated and applied across communities and across the country. Sorry, I live under the flight path and next to 2 schools, so I hope that that's not disturbing the sound too much. No, you can't hear it, that's good. Secondly, we want to put the voices of people most affected by extreme heat in our cities front and centre in the media coverage. And I'm sure it's something other people have noticed as well, is when you've got a heat record, it's 48.9 degrees in Penrith, the front page of the newspaper will be people at Bondi Beach. And so what we're trying to do is make sure it's the people who are being most affected by these issues who are being heard in the media. And thirdly, we're building powerful networks of diverse people and organisations, including CODA, who are here with today. And we're working together to help mitigate and build resilience to catastrophic global warming. We know that extreme heat, rising temperatures and climate change is a health issue. And we can see it as a health issue. We can support the communities that are being most affected. And we can also move away from the highly contested and conflicted space that climate change is at the moment and understand that action on climate change supports all of us and makes us all healthier, makes us all safer, and helps us live in more beautiful, sustainable communities. So Sweltering Cities is a small team with a big impact. In 2020, we launched our last community survey that engaged 700 people across the hottest suburbs in Sydney. This year, we're expanding that into Victoria, Queensland, and we've had requests from the ACT, the Northern Territory, South Australia, and even Karratha in far northwestern Western Australia of people who want to be involved this year. At the end of this, I'll be sharing our link to be, for people who here want to do the survey this year. And at the beginning of the year, we got some coverage in the Sydney Morning Herald, ABC Online, in local media across the city, and in Domain, because we can see that the media is eager to hear those personal stories of how people are affected by extreme heat. I'm just going to share a few slides now with the results of that survey. So fingers crossed, slightly more luck than Clive in doing this. Okay. Loading. Can everyone see a pie chart? Yes, Joan's nodding. Great. So this is just a little bit of information about who did our survey last year. So I said almost 700 people across 170 postcodes, mostly in Western and Southwest Sydney. The suburbs with the most responses were Penrith and Campbelltown, which are both powerfully affected by climate change, and both suburbs where temperatures on the street have been recorded of about 50 degrees or higher. And if you think about walking down the street or going to work or walking to school in 50 degrees, that's a dangerous, deadly temperature for so many in our community. We got a really broad range of people. We asked people what their professions were, everything from a firefighter to a teacher, a hair and makeup artist, some people who were retired, a church assistant. We had a huge range. It was so great to see such diversity in the responses. One of the main things we asked people about was the health impact, and asking them firstly if they felt unwell during the hot days of summer. And we found that a significant proportion of people have felt unwell. Over 10% of people had sought medical care because they felt unwell in the heat. And almost 1 in 4 people have a health condition made worse by extreme heat. So that can be a physical or a mental health impact that people are feeling. If people aren't sleeping overnight, for example, it can increase anxiety. If people are getting dehydrated or feeling the heat, they can get heat stress or heat exhaustion. And this is more common than we think because often heat-related illnesses aren't recorded as being heat-related, but as respiratory or cardiovascular problems if people are presenting to the hospital or to their GP. Almost a third of people said that when it gets very hot, they'll leave the house to go to a cooler location. And in the community meetings we had after this survey, I asked this question of how many people there had done it. And people shared stories of going to the movies on hot days, of sitting in the library all day, or of browsing shops for hours. And the fact that, you know, shop assistants would come up to them and say, oh, can I help you? And they'd say, I'm just trying to escape the heat. And that could feel quite embarrassing. Or they felt very self-aware that, you know, they were just trying to spend their days in somewhere safer and cooler. We asked people how the heat affects different types of activities, you know, and the answers around exercise aren't a surprise. When it gets very hot, people don't want to go outside and be in the sun. And so they sit at home trying to be safe and cool. One of the answers I was really not surprised by, but I think it's really significant, is the answer around socializing. That's showing that extreme heat is keeping people inside, keeping people away from their friends and family. And for people who are really vulnerable to heat, including older people or parents or people with chronic illnesses or disabilities, that isolation during summer, during moments of extreme heat, can make those days even harder and more dangerous because people aren't with others who can check on how they're doing. A huge number of people have trouble sleeping on hot nights and during heat waves, but we also asked people how that felt. Dizzy, tired, cranky, poor concentration, having trouble at work. This affects a huge number of people. So even though we say that extreme heat affects our most vulnerable, and extreme heat has, you know, a bigger effect on older people, people with disabilities, young kids, there's actually a large section of the community that are being affected by extreme heat because they can't sleep overnight. I know I felt that, and so have lots of people I've spoken to. This is where the intersections around inequality, health, and climate change come in. 75% of people have air conditioning, but more than half of them say that cost stops them turning it on. That's why we need more solar power, local renewable energy, so that during the day when people need air conditioning, they can turn it on knowing that they're not going to then later face extremely high power bills. We asked people about the way their suburb is built. We found that more than half of the people in Sydney think that the way their suburb is built increases heat, but that also that result varies. There's more people in Southwest Sydney who think that, and almost 90% of people in Penrith think that the way their suburb is built increases heat. Over 90% of people who we surveyed are concerned that climate change is going to make summers hotter. We know that's probably higher because it's people who are interested in the issue of extreme heat who are doing the survey, but that's still a really compelling number. And even more, we've got that over 90% of people think politicians and political parties should have policies on heat, and they're not seeing that at the moment. That's the end of my slides. I'm really quickly, Joan, if it's okay, going to go into, where is it? Sorry. Going to go into some of the solutions. They can go into the answers as well. But we think that there's 4 big baskets of solutions that people have identified. And that what I've done at community meetings, and I'll do it for a very brief second here, is that I ask people to take a second and think about what their ideal, like, resilient, beautiful, sustainable suburb would look like. Lots of people say trees, schools with solar panels, easy to catch public transport, and making sure the most vulnerable in our community are safe. So there's 4 big baskets. There's things we can do in our homes, like energy efficiency standards. There's infrastructure to cool our suburbs, like shade, ponds, parks, things like that. There's services for people who are most vulnerable, like places that are cool to be able to go, that aren't shops and things like that. So heat shelters and checking on people who might be vulnerable with phone calls. And there's the area of justice, things like making sure rental homes have a minimal standard for thermal comfort so that people who are renting can feel safe in summer. So we're also doing a survey this year. I'm going to share the link in the chat. Thank you for giving me an extra minute. And I'm happy to answer lots of questions. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Thanks very much.
Great, Emma. Emma, thank you so much. I think the results of your survey are really important for the work that we want to do in this sort of policy area, and being able to work with your organisation is a big plus in that regard. We look forward to, in a sense, getting older people to be engaged in further surveys that you're designing. I think I always like the, you referred to individual stories, to Kim, to Peter, to Gemma. I think it's always important to highlight through people's lived experiences what they're going through. And that always makes it more powerful. I've been involved over the years in lobbying governments, and sometimes those individual stories have actually changed policy, which I think is just part of me says it always has to be evidence. But if the evidence then has got the personal stories attached to them, I think that makes policy and advocacy work for the likes of what your organisation's doing and ourselves much stronger. So thank you, and we look forward to coming back to you a little bit later. Thanks, Emma. I'd now like to introduce Peter Holding. Peter is a 3rd generation farmer in southeast New South Wales. He's growing crops such as canola and wheat, as well as running sheep for wool. He works with Farmers for Climate Action and has extensive knowledge and first-hand experience with the strategies that farmers can use to manage and adapt climate change. And we are so thrilled, Peter, to have you with us, because it's really important to hear from farmers about what they're trying to do in regards to climate change and action. So let's see what you've got to say. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Joan, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. And I'm coming to you from Wiradjuri country. Josh knows the area well because parts of his family come from very close to where I live. So good morning to everybody. Now, we set up Farmers for Climate Action, of which I work part-time when I'm not farming, and Josh was involved in that as well. So what we were trying to do was get farmers together to mitigate the impact of climate change and influence government to do things. And this was about 6 years ago. And I guess the main thing we realised over time is that nearly, well, I'd say all, but nearly, probably there's a few recalcitrant farmers that are not doing things, but most farmers are already doing pretty much what's required to combat climate change as much as they can, because it just so happens that good production management is what you would do to solve climate change. So you're trying to get the most production out of your area of land. You're trying to, most people stubble retain, direct drill when it comes to planting crops. Direct drilling means not cultivating. It just means sowing the seed straight into the ground. Many people are trying to conserve moisture to get their crops going. So there's a lot of things that are happening. But there's a limit to what farmers can do. And I think climate change is going to be as disruptive, if not more disruptive, than what we've just seen with the pandemic. We're already seeing food prices starting to take off. I read a story this morning where the Eastern Australian cattle indicator, which is sort of the cattle market price for beef, has passed through the 1100 cents barrier, which they never thought would happen. That'll probably translate to a decent piece of steak being worth somewhere near about $20 to $30 or whatever it might be in the supermarket. So many people are going to be eating a lot less beef. We've got disasters happening in the Lachlan, so there'll be a lot of downgraded grain. So the price of wheat's going up. Canola's above nearly $850 to $900, which is about 3 times what it was a couple of years ago. So all these things are going to impact eventually through the food price and supply. So what do we do about all of this? I think it's important to sort of see climate change not as the 1.1 or the 1.4 degree rise, because many people struggle to get their head around what that actually means. But climate change to me on the farm is all about increased extremes and increased frequency. So we're seeing at the moment, the Lachlan Valley, for argument's sake, is in flood at this time of year, which is kind of unusual. We've had floods before, but we're having an extreme one. And we're seeing temperatures getting to extremes. We're seeing bushfires getting to extremes. I've fought fires in this area for probably 40 years. And I can absolutely guarantee that they're getting much more intense and severe. So this type of intensity is what's causing the problem, because you can't recover from, if you happen to have one of these intense experiences, it's very difficult to recover. And of course, everybody knows and understands drought and how terrible that can be, and goes on and on and on. But I think temperature is going to be a major problem for us all. I see in country areas especially, all these impacts fall more heavily on the poorer sectors of our community. If you don't own your own house, you can't have solar panels, so you can't get cheaper electricity. You can't protect yourself from the heat, and you don't have the capacity to recover when your house gets burnt or a flood comes through or whatever else might happen. So, there's situations developing where people can't afford house insurance. So they're playing Russian roulette with their housing, because sooner or later they're going to get hit by a hailstorm or a flood or a fire. And it's going to be absolutely devastating. And I don't really know how we're going to solve some of these problems unless we all get together. So at Farmers for Climate Action, we have 4 main policies to deal with helping farmers. So we want deep cuts to emissions across the economy, which basically means leaving the fossil fuels in the ground. Fortunately, we actually have technologies at the moment which we can transition to and give us a much cleaner and safer environment to live in. So that shouldn't be as hard as it's been, because we have the technology to do it. If we didn't have, then I could see the problem. But we've just more or less locked in a situation where groups in this economy are trying to get everybody, the citizens, to do the work whilst they take all the profit. And I think we've got to start looking at this social inequity. Our next policy is to expand the Australian Carbon Biodiversity Pilot. So that's about trying to fix up the environment, plant more vegetation to cool the trees, maintain ground cover, increase biodiversity, so we can continue to grow crops and repair areas that have been denuded or destroyed in the past. We want to increase research on methane and cropping technologies because we're going to need to continue to produce food. And we would also like to have people support the Australian Local Power Agency bill, which is in Parliament at the moment, being put forward by Helen Haynes, an independent. The point of that bill is to allow community people, smaller systems to be developed in communities, to allow the local communities to own and fund and take the profit from their own power supply. At the moment, in nearly every community, especially in the country, we've seen the economics develop where just about everything is contracted out. So every time you pay your electricity bill, it doesn't go to the local community where you live, it goes to the head office of wherever the electricity company you're paying is, which is probably in the city or might even be overseas. So that's draining your economy of funds, and it also means they have less capacity to do anything. So we need to stop this sort of continual economic drain out of our communities. We also need to understand that there's opportunities in all of that. If we build sufficient cheap power in many regional areas or wherever, then that then becomes a basis, as it has done for the last 200 years. Cheap power and cheap energy has driven industrial revolution. So we can then redevelop some of the industries in rural Australia instead of taking the option of thinking it's cheaper to buy them from Japan or from China. So things like cool room stores, food processing, all of that sort of stuff, machinery development for farmers, could all be done with cheap energy in rural Australia, close to where they're going to be used. So one of the final things I'd like to say is, and it was a bit like Emma was talking about, what is the community going to do about this? And really we need to build resilience. And resilience is all about working together. It's not about, I know we've had 20 years of, everybody's an individual and we do what we like whenever we like, but as a human community, we need to come together and realise that we're all in this together. So one of the things we're doing at FCA is trying to encourage farmers to talk to each other, to work with each other and communicate their issues to the powers that be. Simply having a whinge in the pub isn't going to solve the problem. But sitting down and writing a letter to your local member, if enough people do that, that will solve the problem because they'll start to get the message. So one of the things we're encouraging people to do is to become more resilient. And resilience is an interesting flavour of the month type word. I heard a lot of it with the bushfires 2 years ago. But it's basically, we're finding that the more resilient people are those that are more connected to their communities. So if you're in an organisation, and I don't particularly care what organisation it is, could be Rotary, it could be FCA, it could be senior citizens, it could be anything, then that is very important when you have an emergency, because it's those organisations that come together to start helping people rebuild their lives. So if I could encourage people to do anything, I would suggest go out there, engage with your community, join your local groups, discuss what they're doing, have a discussion with them about heat and how it's affecting your life, and start putting pressure on your local power brokers, the councils, the local members, federal members, about getting better planning and not having all the planning simply to be on the basis of what is the most profit-driven exercise for developers. So I think that's enough. I'm happy to answer any questions on farming or anything else that people might like to hear about. But really, we're in a terrible situation at the moment. I think by 2030, it's going to be too late. So we've got about another 8 years to sort this problem. And the only way we're ever going to sort it is by people coming together and having a collective voice. So start getting it.
Peter, I couldn't agree with you more. That collective power is so important, from individuals, communities, organisations joining together, because as you said, we can't 2030, even though it's 8 years away, 9 years away, it's like the action has to happen right now. I'm very, I haven't heard much about Farmers for Climate Action, but in the short time that you've shared what you're doing and what you plan to do, that's very influential and really important. And so, Peter, it's a national organisation?
Oh yes, it's
Yes,
national,
I thought
and
it was, yes.
we lobby up and down. So we
Yep.
do on ground work, and we send delegations to Canberra and the state. I've been working with the New South Wales Net Zero team on the renewable energy programs, and we put in a delegation which we've had meetings with people like Michael McCormack, and they're going to present our report to Parliament at the federal level. So there's a whole lot of different levels and activities, and it's pretty busy, mostly done by volunteers.
Yes, yeah, same with us. And it's a small team of paid people, but mostly volunteers. That's the way it is. We're resilient we have to be resilient within the work that we do. There was one thing you just mentioned, which I'll just make a comment now. I think you mentioned local government, and it's just a reminder to everyone out there that we have local government elections coming up on December 4, I think it is.
Yep, it is December 4.
So that's really important for people to have their say. But thank you very much, Peter. We'll come back to you. And I'd now like to introduce Josh Gilbert. Hi, Josh. There he is.
Hi,
He's a Warrama man, First Nations person. Obviously, Peter and he are mates. Josh is a farmer and an academic who shares the narration of Indigenous identity through agricultural truths and considering modern contexts. He's actually undertaking a higher degree at Charles Sturt University and is the Indigenous co-chair of Reconciliation New South Wales. We're so thrilled to have you with us, Josh. So over to you.
Thanks, Joan, and thanks to Coda for having me today. It's really a privilege, I guess, to be here and to really listen to some really incredible speakers. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A and hearing a bit more from all the people that you've got joining us from across New South Wales. So thank you for that. I'm just going to have a go at sharing slides too, and hopefully this works. Works well. A smile there. Thanks, Joan. So I'm Josh Gilbert. I'm a Worimi man from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. This is Worimi country. This is country that my parents, particularly on my dad's side of the family, have a real connection to. And this is a place I very much call home. I want to start by acknowledging my elders past and present on these lands and pay respects to all the work that they've done, and also to all the Aboriginal people right across not only New South Wales but also Australia, and thank them for the contributions that they've made to making sure that we have what we have today. I specifically focus now on Indigenous agriculture and climate change, connecting all those together to try and understand what this current state means for us. I'm looking specifically as part of my research at Charles Sturt on what Indigenous agriculture means post-colonisation. So therefore, it's the conversation after, James Cook founded Australia in 1788, and looking at the interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people since then. I try and do that in a strengths-based lens. My own story here on Worimi country goes back to 1824, where my Indigenous ancestors clashed with some of the white pastoralists that came up onto this country. And since that time, my family have been engaged in Western agriculture, or farming that we know it as today. And for me, it's that grounding, I guess, that I always keep going back to and trying to understand what times would have been like then, and also how that's progressed in society since those early years up until now. So I wanted to... Not going. Let me work on that. So I wanted to share this map first, and this is all the different language groups that we have across Australia. It's a map provided by an organisation called AATSIS, which is the Aboriginal and Islander research hub here in Australia. And you'll see, if you have a look at my mouse here, Worimi country is up here, right on coastal country. We've got the mountain ranges, which is where I am in Gloucester today, and the country goes back across to Foster and all the way down to Newcastle. So it's quite a, I mean, it's not as big as Wiradjuri country, but it's quite a big holding, I guess, here, and it's very much home for us here. It's a land that's still living with culture, and I think when we start thinking about climate change and the impacts on landscapes, we often don't acknowledge that culture is living here. And we know that while our mob connects here in a very different way, we're still very much connected. We are still here, still living and still thriving and still engaging in cultural practices every day. So this country is very important to us. And if I share a quick bit of insight from this country, we traditionally would move from the hilly country, this mountain country in Gloucester, over to the coast when the hairy worm would come out and wriggle across. And that was an indication that this country needed a break, that we needed to move to the coast, and that fishing was good, that tucker was good over there. And as the wattle flowered, there was another sign that certain fish species would come out. And as it slowly died, there was another fish species that we chase here. So this country still speaks to us. The impacts of climate change obviously impact when that happens, but it's still very much a telltale of how culture happens here and how we connect to this landscape. We're also a community just in Gloucester that has probably been through what a lot of some of the communities across Australia have been through. Just in the last 2 years alone, we've been through one of the worst droughts that even my grandfather can remember during his time. We've seen the effects of that on our farming communities and our township. Once the drought came through, we also had fire, because drought wasn't enough to deal with, and the fires here had quite an impact on land around here. And just because Mother Nature likes throwing us a few curveballs now and then, we also had flooding. So our main street almost a year ago flooded, so we had water going through some of the shops and the shop fronts just down towards the river. So we've definitely seen the impacts of climate change on this country. And we know that the impacts of that are continuing to impact the way in which we operate as a community. Not sure why this isn't changing. So why do I specifically focus on Indigenous ag? Well, there's a few reasons behind that. The first is that we actually don't have much of an appreciation of what Indigenous agriculture is today. And we don't necessarily acknowledge that Indigenous people were involved in Western agriculture post-colonisation. Why do we need to do that? Well, there's a few reasons. One is to actually enable healing and for culture to continue. One is to pay respect to all the Indigenous elders out there and young people who have been, who struggle to fit into a current agricultural system. And we also know that most of the conversation that happens in Australia really focus on the pre-colonial phase. And what that does, in my perspective, is creates this real fixed view on what Indigenous people are. It kind of has a hesitation, I guess, that, that our time has kind of come, that we lived as a race pre-colonization that was pure, and we're unable to adapt into modern society. And that's a view that's about 40 years behind that of international perspectives around the world. So we really need to understand and have this broader view of what Indigenous agriculture means, so that we can start thinking about what role Indigenous ag will have when we start thinking about climate change. If you have a look at the picture on the right-hand side of your screen there, what you'll notice there is that there is quite a lot of land still held, even by a Western sense today, that's held by Indigenous people. The Australian government estimate that's between 45 and 60% of Australia's landmass, which is quite a lot. And research out of the Barilla Food Centre has shown that all of these lands, all the Indigenous held lands, will have to be relied upon to ensure that we can continue feeding the Australian population and exporting food overseas into the future. So that means that of the 3% of our Indigenous population, 45 to 60% of Australia's landmass is owned by them. In fact, they're actually very much, we as people are very much underrepresented in Indigenous agriculture generally, but also in terms of Indigenous leadership. And that's something that we really need to change. So I just wanted to share this quick slide. This is a quote that was shared to me by one of my mentors, one of the people who are looking over my research as well, a guy called Stan Grant, who I'm sure some of you might have heard of before. I was struggling with this kind of thought that we needed to try and define Indigenous agriculture and the nuances within that. And Stan shared this kind of idea with me, which has really kind of impacted my research and the way in which I think about this. So an Aboriginal person farming today is as authentically Aboriginal as he or she would have been throughout time. We are the same people, but just the people in change. And if you think about that, that explains why my skin is not as dark as what even I would like it to be. You know, as I said, my family go back to 1824 when we started mixing in with, my Indigenous family started mixing with white society. And there's a whole heap of reasons behind that. And you know, there's a whole heap of dialogue that needs to happen around that. But we're the same people. We're still authentically Aboriginal. And as we go through time, Indigenous people will start looking different, but also start acting in a way that's culturally relevant to today's society. We're a living, fluid race of people, not fixed, just like everyone joining us today. You've all grown up in different areas. We've now got these things, mobile phones that we might never have had before that we use every day. We connect in different ways. We're using Zoom, you know, to connect and share these conversations. We all change, and it's not fair from my perspective that we look at Indigenous people as not being able to do that. So we know mob out there are changing. We're the highest adopters of technology anywhere in Australia as well. So our mob are changing as well, just as what all of you are. So I just wanted to quickly summarize what this kind of key picture is, I guess, from my perspective. We know that Indigenous people played an important part in our Australian agricultural landscape. That's including post-colonisation. We had Indigenous shearers, cattlemen, drovers, we're all involved in agriculture over the last 200 years, not just pre-colonisation. Australia is really left dragging the chain behind all of our international colleagues. We're actually 40 years behind, and we need to start understanding that Indigenous agriculture is really important to having international conversations around this and to acknowledge the work that's done here. And to do that, we need leadership and understanding of what's happened. We need acknowledgement of that, and we need to allow both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to heal with some of the realities of what happened in ag back in the early days. We also need to acknowledge that Indigenous mob from right across Australia, only 45 to 60% of Australia's landmass, and that's vital to address climate change in the future. Unless we start negotiating and having agreements between non-Indigenous and Indigenous farmers, or upskilling Indigenous farmers, there is a massive amount of country that's going to be just left with nothing happening on that country when we actually really need that to continue feeding our population. So what can you do? I always like finishing on something that I would encourage you to do. And from my perspective, that's to start listening and sharing your stories. Everyone has a story around agriculture and food. Everyone has a connection to mob, whether it's your local mob or your interactions with our mob from right across Australia. I just encourage you to start listening to mob, listening to our stories, but also sharing your stories, because it's through those stories that we can start connecting and we can start creating those real connections that we need to address climate change. Thanks, Joan. I'm happy to take some questions as well with the rest of the team, but thanks very much for the opportunity to present to you today.
Well, Josh, I think your enthusiasm and your knowledge for a young First Nations man is quite extraordinary, and I'm so thrilled that Stan Grant is going to be, or is one of your mentors. But the importance of what you talked about regarding cultural practices and the knowledge of Indigenous First Nations people around agriculture, we could all learn so much from that. And it is a matter of understanding that and joining forces. So thanks, Josh. We'll come back to you later in the panel. Now, the next person that's going to share some information with us is via video, and keep your fingers crossed that it's going to work. Her name is Rebecca Huntley. Some people might know of her work. She's an author and a researcher on social trends. and was the director of the Mind and Mood Report for nearly 9 years. She works closely with the Sunrise movement on Climate Compass, on the Climate Compass project. And she's got a great way of teaching us all how we can talk about climate change and action. So, across to the video. Thanks very much. Felix is going to help us, so let's have a look at it.
Hi to everyone at COTA New South Wales. My name's Rebecca Huntley. I apologise I can't be there with you live. It's been a bit of a schedule clash, my fault, I apologise. But it's terrific to have this opportunity for the next 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about, to give you my Climate Communications 101 presentation. And if you have any questions off the back of this, please direct them towards Megan. I'll be really happy to respond to an email or a phone call if you have any further questions. So let me see if I can share my screen. I think I'd be very familiar to do this. Yes, there we go. You can see there a shameless plug for my book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. But today will be a kind of combination of my observations and theories that I developed through writing the book and through doing work for a whole range of organisations, corporates, NGOs, peak bodies, you name it, around climate communications. And I'll also be speaking specifically about a piece of research I'm involved in called Climate Compass. So let me start from the first, let me start from the beginning. So in research that I did for the book, I went over to Yale University. Yale and George Mason have a long-running project they call the Six Americas, which is a segmentation, audience segmentation that divides the American population into specific groups in terms of their attitudes and behaviour on climate. I went there to interview a whole lot of social scientists for my book, but while I was there, I met a fantastic woman who had been the head of campaigns for the Audubon Society. As you can see there, there's a bird as part of its logo. So the Audubon Society is one of those, 100-year-old plus heritage environmental protection organisations. Sorry, that's my cavoodle barking at somebody walking past the house. And she was really interesting. She shared with me a fantastic experience she had with the Audubon Society in relation to communicating around climate. The Audubon Society was a membership organisation. A lot of their members tended to be older, unlike a lot of traditional climate and environment organisations that tend to skew progressive. This was an organisation that had, a real spectrum of people who were engaged and not engaged in politics. And, obviously because they were a bird protection organisation, there was a lot of bird watchers and bird enthusiasts who were their members. Lindsay, who was this campaign manager, was determined and optimistic about mobilising this membership group in getting them active around climate. And she did it by convincing the board and the executive of the Audubon Society that if they started their engagement with members around birds, something that they already loved and already knew the changes in the environment were affecting birds, the way they migrated, the way they nested and so forth, and then found a way to, I suppose, tiptoe through the usual climate script, working out what were the kinds of the barriers to them engaging with climate. And then that if they managed to do that they could get them active. And in fact, she managed to do that. She absolutely did work out what they didn't really like about the way that climate communication was traditionally or conventionally conveyed, communicated to them in the media and elsewhere, worked out what started with the thing that they valued, the thing that they loved, the thing that they wanted to protect, and the thing that they realised was under threat. And managed to get them quite active around climate, to everybody's surprise, perhaps not to her. And when I encountered her in this campaign that was effective, that she was engaged with, it made me think of some other work that has been done actually coming out of Australia with previous social scientists from the CSIRO and psychologists coming out of the University of Western Australia, including Dr. Carmen Lawrence. They did a piece of work, published a bit of work around this idea about objects of care, which is that if we start the conversation around climate with the things that people value, the things that they matter, not necessarily like talking about climate change or talking about the science, not necessarily a science-first approach to communicating, and we link that with climate, and we get people to understand that the things that matter to them today are impacted by the climate, then, and we bridge what is this kind of psychological difference between ourselves and climate change, then it can make it seem more relevant, and it can lead to being more engaged and being more active around climate. So starting with objects of care was what Lindsay was attempting to do with the members of the Audubon Society. And it's a very, it's a common and effective way to communicate about climate. For an organisation like you, who represent and advocate for the interests of older Australians, thinking about the challenges and the opportunities and the capacity for older Australians to live their best possible life today, understanding how that may or may not be threatened or changed or made even more challenging by climate is generally the way to go. So coming out of the book and researching all the social science around climate communications, interviewing climate communicators or climate activists from around the world, I came up with a series of principles around talking about climate change in a way that makes it seem relevant, important, and actionable for people. I suppose the first thing always is to understand your audience. Who are your stakeholders? How do they feel about the issue? And how might you be able to relate action on climate change or climate impacts to the things that really matter to them? Listening and keep listening. I think so much about the climate discussion, especially in Australia, given the very kind of divisive nature of climate politics, that's not, seems to be not going away anytime soon, although we're moving towards a bit more of a consensus around the fact that we do have to act and act quickly. But, so much of the discussion around climate in public forums like Twitter or in federal parliament or whatever, in terms of where it gets talked about, seems to be one of people shouting their views at other people, seems highly polarised, highly divisive. So it's really important as you engage your audience, not only to understand where they're coming from, but listen to them and keep listening, and to make sure that that's an ongoing iterative process. Encouraging them to talk, encouraging that discussion. In some ways, breaking the climate silence, the fact that people who are, not really, really strong advocates of climate or climate deniers don't really talk about it much, find it hard to talk about, don't feel they know enough to talk about it. The fact that you're actually starting the discussion in an open way to invite people to really be honest about how they feel about it and what their concerns and their questions are is really important, and a win in itself. I've used the term decarbonisation here, but it's a very technical term. But I suppose I would say connecting action on climate change with current value and values. So it's another version of what I was talking about when I said starting with object of care. What are the things that the audience or the group that you are representing really value? What is it they want? What is it they want to gain? What is it they want to protect? What is it they want to, what is it they generally want out of their lives? And how do you connect action on climate with those goals? And I suppose the other question is values more broadly. What you'll see in a minute with our segmentation is that different groups of Australians have different social, ethical, values and mindset, and finding a way to communicate action on climate that links with that is really important. I'll explain about that in a minute, but really understanding that's really just understanding where people are coming from, what matters to them, and how do you draw a strong line between all of those questions and climate action, and also climate impacts. Part of it's about what the opportunity is, but also what the risk is, which leads me to my next point about balancing loss and gain. Coming into climate, really kind of immersing myself in the research for the book, I kind of started with a somewhat naive idea that, you know, in order for us to convince people who aren't already convinced on the urgency of climate action on climate, that we had to be really positive and talk about, you know, it's all going to be great and it's all going to be wonderful if we act on climate, it'll all be terrific. And I still think that that's important, and that's important for some audiences more than others. But we do need to be honest, and we also do need to recognise that behaviour change, that people behave, if we're asking people to behave differently or do different things or shift their mindset in some cases, we have to recognise that there are costs to inaction as well as opportunities from action. So balancing loss and gain is really important. We can't bright side all of this. There are going to be, if we do not act quickly, there is a genuine risk. That risk is those losses are already happening. And so we do need to find a way to communicate that, A, because it's disingenuous not to, and B, because people are never really entirely motivated just through positive messages. It's that kind of, you know, balance of, oh, if you don't do something, there's going to be a consequence, and that means you're going to lose something that you value, there's going to be problems down the track. But also, if you do act, there's real opportunities, not just in terms of risk mitigation, but in terms of actual positive things that you may not have now that you would have in the future if you acted. And then finally, hope is other people. I think one of the great barriers to action for some groups is the idea that we've made action on climate very much about individual behaviour around the home, or consuming less, or eating less meat, or, you know, driving less, or whatever. And while all of those consumer behaviour and individual contributions to climate are important, they're nowhere near the things that are going to really bring about the great shifts that we need in this period of time that we have. So we really don't want to emphasise the idea that the pathway towards a safer climate is all just upon me and how I behave as an individual. We do need to show that power in that collective action, power in lots of different organisations coming together to work together. And so that idea of hope about addressing climate change is about other people. It is about groups of people, networks of organisations deciding to act collaboratively to bring about this change that is so desperately needed. There's some basic ideas there in terms of how you talk about climate change in a way that will feel relevant and useful, and hopefully cut through to audiences who aren't already, you know, on board.
Okay, well, some more information, very worthwhile, and there'll be more of Rebecca's presentation that'll be hooked on to the recording of this. So we've just given you a couple of highlights, but I think some key messages from her: breaking the climate silence and what the cost to inaction is. So, folks, we're going to go now to our panelists to ask some questions. Some questions have come through, so I'll try and get through those as well. So if I can get all the panelists to come and join me again, that would be terrific. Thank you. Now, there's one question here. I'm not sure who can answer this. There's one there for you, Emma, and you could probably answer that yourself, but it's a worthwhile question. But there's one from Martin who says, an increase in the average temperature of, say, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound very much. As Peter mentioned, the issue is much greater, the impact of increased extremes. Would one of the panelists please explain the tail issue? That is, how the increase in average translates to a far greater frequency of extreme heat, tropical storms, floods and fires. So is that one for you, Clive? One for Peter?
Yeah, it's an important question, and it's kind of tricky to answer, certainly without showing charts. But yeah, I mean, global temperatures and within parts of the Earth, temperatures fluctuate around the average, obviously. And if you shift the whole curve, you know, across to the right by 1.5 or 2 degrees, you shift the tail of the weather distribution across to the right as well. And that means that the extremes that happen at the tail, that tail becomes a lot bigger. And that's why with only 1.1 or actually degrees of global warming, which is actually 1.4 in Australia, we've seen a fairly sharp increase in the number of very hot periods and associated fires, for example. And if we get to 2 degrees or 3 degrees, that tail of extreme events becomes much bigger. And so we have many, substantially more droughts, floods in other areas. It's, you get drying in parts of Australia, but increased intense rainfall in other parts of Australia leading to floods. And you get fires associated with droughts and extreme events. And so that's why, we can just see, even with globally 1.1 degrees of warming, the weather in Australia has really changed kind of markedly. We've talked mostly about humans so far. We haven't talked about the impact on the natural world, on animals and reptiles, not to mention corals and fish. But if we get to 2 degrees, let alone 3, which is almost unthinkable, those extreme events are going to multiply so much that large parts of Australia will become uninhabitable, let alone farmable. And so that's why, 1.5 might not sound much for the average, but if you get there, the tails, as Martin says, that is the extreme events, become much more frequent.
You're on mute, Joan.
Joan, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. I get so worried, and then I think, oh, come on, facilitate, Joan. But after you just said that, I think, oh, is there anything out of the Glasgow outcomes, commitments, Clive, that gives you any hope? Rebecca says we need to have hope. Oh, you're on mute now.
Yep.
Yep.
Now, hope amongst those who have been engaged in climate change, this question of hope has been really intensively debated for a very long time, because hope can be very deceptive. Hope can lead to wishful thinking. Hope can lead us to think that everything will be all right, when in fact things are getting very, very bad. And I interviewed quite a number of young climate activists last year in Australia and abroad. And they're kind of sick of talking about hope, and they really don't like older people saying, oh, thank God you're being active, you give us hope, because they feel as though this whole question of the future of the world is now being dumped on their shoulders. And, they read the scientific reports and they are not hopeful. They think the world is heading to real trouble, for their futures. And so, quite a lot of them are saying, we don't think it would be ethically justifiable to bring a baby into a world that is going where the world is going. Now, if you think about that, that's very, very profound. It's substantial numbers of young people saying we're not going to have children because we think it would be wrong to do so. That reflects the kind of profound psychological impact of global warming and the future in a warming world that is taking place in the minds of young people, particularly these young climate activists. It's very widespread amongst school students. So, sorry, I just talked about the depressing parts of it all rather than the hope. I'm just very wary about saying, let's look for the hopeful signs, because I think that's a trap. If you're always thinking, well, we should have hope, and this idea that we must have hope because otherwise people will become depressed and inactive. I don't think that's true. I mean, these young activists are pessimistic about the future, but that only drives them on. And it's their collaboration in school strikes for climate, for example, it's that sustains them in their activism.
Replace hope with the word activism.
Yep.
Yep.
Indeed. And there's a lot of evidence saying that for people to become depressed about the situation, the best response to that is to become active, and to become active with other people.
Good point. Yes, Peter?
I'll just add a bit there, because I do see some hope, which is weird in farming, because one of the problems with extremes is that it takes 6 months to produce a crop of wheat or canola or whatever it is. And we need 6 months of nice, stable weather. And that's going to be harder and harder to get. So that's a bit of a problem. But what I am seeing over the years that have gone by, and especially out of COP, is that most of the business world these days and a great deal of the community are demanding action and are sitting in their own businesses and working out where they sit and where they're going to invest and how they're going to continue on with their economy. And that gives me hope, because I think they will lead the way. I don't think they'll continue to invest in things that they don't think are viable, which is fossil fuels. And whether the governments wake up and come along for the ride, I'm not too sure, but that gives me some hope. But yes, you know, I have a problem with hope too, because I look at the net zero plan released by our wonderful government, and it's based on the hope that we will somehow or other invent a magic pudding and some new technology or whatever it might be. That's a pretty iffy sort of way of going about this problem, I would have thought. But anyway.
Oh, yes. Emma, you had your hand up. You were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I did. I just wanted to look at Bob, and I like to think of myself as a youngish climate activist. I hope to live past 2070, so I'll probably see lots of the impacts. And I think I'm hopeful. I think people are hopeful sometimes and pretty depressed about things and other times. But what I try and hold on to isn't hope, it's optimism. And I'm deeply optimistic that together we can actually turn things around. And I'm not optimistic every day that we can get to 1.5, but I am optimistic partly because, you know, even today we've got Jane and Annie and Elizabeth and other people who are coming to a climate change seminar, sharing their experience with extreme heat, and people like Sarah who are saying, you know, how are we going to get involved? How are we going to do this together? I want to contribute. And so I think it's the optimism of coming together. And there's a woman called Cristina Figueres who wrote a book called The Future We Choose. And she was the key negotiator for the Paris Agreement. She's a Costa Rican diplomat. And she talks about the different mental frameworks we need to get to the future we want. And one of them is optimism, and the other one is abundance. And thinking of, you know, climate action not as a reduction of quality of life or a reduction in the things we'll have to live with, but of saying we are choosing abundant fresh air. We are choosing abundant agriculture and soils and water and renewable energy. And I think being optimistic and framing in terms of abundance will help us have more days that are hopeful instead of days that are depressed. And I say that as someone who often thinks about the worst parts of what I will live with.
Yeah. That's why we need young people like you involved. We'll be dead and gone, some of us, by the time.
Youngish, Joe.
And Josh, from your perspective as a First Nations man, I mean, you talked about the importance of us sharing stories with you, and you guys, your mob sharing stories with us. But how do governments actually consider the wealth of knowledge that you guys have got and some of our activism? I mean, how can we get that together to formulate a change to climate change policy?
Yeah, so for me, it's mostly about just talking to government. And I think to Peter's point before, like just this week, I've spoken at a convention of all the universities across Australia. I spoke to my former colleagues at PwC across Australia and New Zealand and the Australia Pacific area. And now all of you today. I think what we're seeing is this mass amount of community and in government, and business pressure on governments to try and change, and we need more of that. And one of the kind of crazy things about COVID that's happened is that our young people are now seeing and demanding more from the organizations that they work for. There's this war on talent that's happening at the moment of, you know, businesses and others trying to attract young talent in because they know that we need a workforce to continue doing all the work that happens across Australia. And as that happens, young people will start demanding more upon businesses, and businesses will have to shift. And I think this is kind of what happens anyway out of COP. So I went to Paris back in 2015, and it was the business community that was doing the change, and maybe not as much now. Maybe not as much then. They're doing a lot more now, but they're actually leading all this. And governments are just slow; they drag their heels and don't necessarily align to what community and industry and you know the rest of society is doing. And I think for me, that's the big loss, that when they're not reflective of what the rest of society is doing, and that's when we need a democratic system to start working to its full effect. If I give it a quick example of that, Joan, in the ag space, sorry, just quickly, the Meat and Livestock Association of Australia, the organisation that represents all cattle producers in Australia and red meat producers, already has a 2030 target that includes a reduction in the emissions of methane. And we couldn't get our federal government to agree to that target, even though industry is saying that's what we want, or that's what we're focused on. So when you have that misalignment, then that's when we need to start creating change.
And Peter, you might have something to say about that. I mean, both you and Josh live in rural New South Wales. I guess it's about what your communities can do. I mean, you're doing so much as individuals, and the connections that you have in spreading some of the messages that you've both shared today. But how can we sometimes mobilise, the rural and remote? I mean, I'm always worried about the remote communities. Get them behind us, because some of those people don't get the same information as we do, and some of them are getting misinformation, as we know. So what do you do in your local communities just to get people being more active and connecting about this issue?
Well, fundamentally, it's like Rebecca said, just getting the conversation going. We've got to have, like, there was a time, I suppose 10 years ago, where, like, I've been in this for a long time, and I went through the Climate Champions program and various other things, and we started off talking about global warming, for argument's sake. And then the government decided we could only talk about climate change, and then we had to talk about climate variability, and pretty much they sacked all the scientists under Abbott, and we weren't allowed to talk about that. And so they keep trying to shut the debate down. My attitude is we've got to go out there and have the difficult conversations. And somebody else has asked a question, what do I do personally? Or what can a person do personally? And that's an interesting question, because I come back to the point, do you want an easy answer or do you want the hard answer? And the hard answer is go out and discuss these issues with your community, your family, the people you come into contact with, the people you work with. You don't have to be nasty about it. Just ask the question, well, how's my grandmother going to get from her house to the supermarket on a 50-degree day? Like, how are we going to solve a problem like that? And we start working on those sorts of problems, then we'll come up with the answer. I'm absolutely certain humans have got the capacity to come up with the answers. The trouble is we're easily diverted. We like our little blue trinkets, throw something at us. So, the government wants to make believe that if we get rid of a couple more cows, it'll solve the problem. Most farms in this country are pretty much almost carbon neutral now. And the work we've done with New South Wales government is that if we revegetated 10% of properties, and I can't think of many properties except maybe specialist irrigation and smaller farms that don't have 10% waste land on their property, or hilltops, or creek lines, or whatever else it might be. If we vegetate those 10%, we will be at net zero. So the issue is not about cutting back on producing food or anything else, but it's about getting communities to start working out the problem of solving this. They talk about the grid can't take any more renewable energy. Well, it can't, because it's bloody well built for an old technology of 100 years ago. Start building the damn thing so it can. There's no problem with putting small solar panel systems into the wires you see around your suburbs, your 220 kilovolt lines. The problem is with the big, massive solar farms overload the system. So what we've got to do is have a distributed system where everybody in a community has small bed on their house, on a corner block or whatever it is, set up the system so that the community own it and it's distributed broadly, and none of it overloads a particular part of it. Not that hard to do.
No. I'm going to just do a bit of a time check. We're getting close towards the end, and we've still got a couple of really important questions to talk about. So just for all of the people that have joined us, I will aim to finish at 12:10. So we're just going to have 10 more minutes. Now, if you can't stay on with us, that's absolutely fine. I get that. I always like to go a bit further because the conversations are very rich and important. And just remember, folks, if you do have to leave us, that this will be available on CODA New South Wales YouTube. Now, I want to go back to Clive because in 2014, Clive, you presented a lecture on geoengineering. And I mean, this is the stuff that really scares me, and but we do need to get the truth. So how dramatically do you think our lives will change if the current trajectory will hit 2.6 degrees by 2015? Would it be possible to adapt?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. Yeah, the geoengineering schemes, some of them, quite scary to think we might, for example, as some serious people are saying, we are going to need to do, pump sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, basically to create a layer of sulfur pollution very high up in the atmosphere in order to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, I mean, the whole Earth. In other words, installing a kind of thermostat. And I wrote a book about that called Earth Masters, which raises all kinds of problems, like who exactly is going to have their hand on the global thermostat? Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Joe Biden. I mean, who is going to regulate it? So there are lots of problems, but, this is a conversation which is gathering strength, and we need to think about it. On the adaptation question, we're heading for 2.4 after Glasgow, if promises are fulfilled. So we need stronger promises. So can we adapt? Well, I mean, we've heard a lot of really interesting, actually fascinating and inspiring things today about adaptations that are being made to a warming climate, particularly from Emma and Peter. But people are, and that's great, and that's necessary. But, it's one thing to adapt to 2 degrees of warming. If we're thinking about changing farming systems, flood defences, protecting the barrier reef, it's quite a different thing to adapt to a 3 degree system warming. And so we might be in a sort of constant process of adaptation where it becomes more difficult and more expensive to sustain communities, certainly where they are. And that's not before we get to the social and political disruption that 2.5 or 3 degree world would lead to. For example, there are vast numbers of people in poor countries or on low-lying islands who suddenly can't survive. There's going to be a massive migration crisis, and Australia will look pretty attractive. Similarly, there'll be conflicts over resources, for example, water coming off the Himalayas. So geopolitical conflict is quite possible. So this is the kind of world that, in a way, it's too scary to think about, but there are people writing about it. The US military, for example, and the Australian military are now doing scenario planning for what it's going to be like in a hot world. So it's massive, which is why it's so crucial to limit warming to the Paris targets. Without that, it's hard to imagine. If we got to 2.5 or certainly 3, it's hard to imagine how human societies can really survive in anything like their current form.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, there's a few other questions that we haven't got to. I'm very sorry, panelists, but I think it's been it's like one of those areas of knowledge that you think, what can we do? But of course, we've talked about some of the things that we can do collectively, and all of you are doing very important things in your own work and in your own communities. But I guess I'd like to finish with a question to all of you. What do you think is the single most important thing that an individual can do to impact climate change action? Who'd like to start? Peter.
Let me jump in, and just very quickly, I'd suggest that the best thing we can do as older Australians is to support young people, to support the young climate activists, because they are powering the shift more than anything else in societies like Australia. So let's help support them however we can.
I'm into intergenerational work, Clive. That to me is a good example of intergenerational policy work. Where different generations get together because they are the people with our wisdom and knowledge, and together that's absolutely a great idea. Who wants to?
I'll have a
you
little
want to
say.
crack at it, Peter? Good.
I'll make one statement up front so it's clear that it's my opinion and not FCA's opinion, because we have certain rules that I'm not allowed to break, and this one will break it. In the short term, I personally think the only hope we've got is to get rid of the government and get a new one. But working for a not political organisation, I agree with Clive. I think supporting young people, I'd like to see. I think education is critical. I see so much misinformation around that we need to educate people in two areas. One is how government and democracy works. There's an election coming up in 2 weeks' time, and the number of people I run into that don't even know that their council's being elected, or how to go about it, or what it means, optional preferential voting, and all sorts of things they don't understand. So heaven knows how it'll work. But we need to be educating people in how their democracy works. And secondly, we need to be educating them in how to, what critical thinking means, and how to assess whether a piece of writing is just a load of rubbish or whether it actually is important.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Peter. Emma, and then we'll go to you, Josh.
I think that the most important thing we can do is make our conversations about climate change tangible and local. And that's everything from demanding accountability from our local representatives. It doesn't matter what seat you're in, you need to make sure your local MP knows how you feel, and that's your council candidates, that's your federal and state MPs and the candidates. That's something we can do. But also we need to make sure our conversations with our friends and families and networks are about, what we can do locally in terms of how we can shape our cities, the choices we can make in terms of our food and our transport and things like that, but also talk about the benefits for climate action that are local as well, including clean water, clean air, comfortable schools, fresh fruit and vegetables. So tangible and local, and talk to your representatives. Let's make climate change an issue in every single seat, from Penrith to Karratha, right? Let's do it.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Very inspirational. And to you, Josh, you see, you go last because you're the youngest.
For me, I think, I agree with Peter. We do need government change, but what I think we should also be doing is giving praise to those who have been doing a lot of work. So those people, Australia has the highest PV rates in the world. It's a statistic that gets touted by government all the time, but at the end of the day, that's individuals having their own action, whether that be for climate change or for financial reasons. Individuals have done their part, and we see that in the ag space a lot. There's a lot of farmers who are doing the most amazing work out there and who need a bit of credit for the work that they have done. And through that, I think we can continue to put pressure on government to say that you need to change and start aligning with the work that us as society are doing as well.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Josh. Well, that's draws me to the end of our webinar, and can I please thank Clive Hamilton, Emma Bacon, Peter Holding, and Josh Gilbert on behalf of everyone out there who's been hopefully inspired to actually take some action. So thank you so much. It was just it was a very, very, very important topic, of course, but you all presented different perspectives, and I appreciate that, and thank you on behalf of all the people who've joined us. So folks, that's the last of our webinars for 2021. But of course, we're going to continue doing this because we want to be able to reach out to more people across New South Wales, and this is a very cost-effective way of doing it. So just a reminder that an email will be going out to all of you, and some of the presenters will be able to give you extra information and resources. And I also acknowledge Rebecca Huntley's work, and there'll be some more of her video available to you as well. As we come to the end of 2021, I have to say it's been a hell of a year for many people, and for many older people. But it is a time, hopefully, where we can come together to catch up with family and friends now that that's possible. So wherever you're going to spend the summertime, I hope that you can spend it with those people that you love and people that love you, and be very mindful that our time is limited in some ways. And so to be able to share some good cheer and some happiness and do it in a safe environment. I think that's my wish to all of you out there for the end of 2021. And I look forward to seeing you all in 2022. I'll be back. CODA New South Wales is not going anywhere. And this year we've celebrated our 65th birthday. So we'll be looking forward to celebrating more birthdays as our advocacy and policy work gets stronger. So thanks again, all the panelists. Thank you, everyone out there. That's the end. Happy New Year. 2022 has to be a better year. Bye for now.